There's one last way that EF Core allows you to take advantage of your existing or new procedures, and that's with stored procedure mapping. And by that, I mean mapping stored procedures to your entities to perform inserts, updates, and deletes instead of letting EF Core write the SQL. Why would you want to do that? While I've been creating new procedures for my demo app and database, most of us are working with pre-existing databases that have a lot of logic in them already. And you might already have procedures to handle these particular operations. They could be straightforward or have important business logic in them. And in some companies, you're required to use those. But that doesn't mean that you can't take advantage of EF Core. Whatever your reason, it is possible to override EF Core's creation of the insert, update, or delete statements when you call save changes, and have EF Core use your procedures instead. A note in the EF Core docs clarifies that they aren't suggesting you should just use stored procedures over EF Core's SQL generation. Definitely default to letting EF Core do its job, and use this feature when you have an explicit need to do so. Key to this ability are 3 methods that you can use in the onModel creating method in your DB context, and they're pretty clearly named: insert using stored procedure, update using stored procedure, and delete using stored procedure. For those of you who have been around EF for a while, you might remember that we used to have a capability like this, but it was really complicated and required a UI tool. But when EF Core came along, there was no comparable feature until EF Core 7 brought us these mappings. And I can tell you that doing this using the mappings is an enormous improvement. I'm only going to show you a simple example, forcing EF Core to use an existing author insert procedure instead of generating an insert command for new authors. Using the update and delete methods follow a similar pattern, so you can extrapolate from my example, but also learn more from the docs and other resources I'll link to at the end of this module. It's probably no surprise that I now have an insert author stored procedure in my database. You'll find the new migration that I used to create this in the downloads. The procedure takes in a first name and a last name. It inserts those into the authors table, and rather than using an output parameter, it takes advantage of the output inserted clause that we've seen EF Core use for inserts numerous times in this course. Given that this procedure now exists, let's take a look at mapping it. Here's the new mapping in onModel creating of the DB context. It starts by specifying that it is a mapping for the author entity. Then I've appended the insert using stored procedure method, which expects the procedure name as its first parameter, and there it is, author insert. Then the next parameter is a lambda expression describing how to build up the command to send to the stored procedure. And we start by defining each parameter using a hasParameter method. So my procedure has 2 parameters. The first one expects the first name, so I'm using the hasParameter method to send in the value of author first name. Then another hasParameter method describes the value for the second parameter, and that will come from the author's last name. If my procedure expected an output parameter, there's a method to describe that as well. But instead, I've got that result coming back. So I'm using another method, hasResultColumn, and specifying that the result needs to go into the author's author ID property. There's a lot more you can do with this mapping, but this is all I need for my particular stored procedure. So let's see it in action. Here's a new method that simply creates a new author, adds it to the DB set, and calls save changes. When I run it, we can see in the SQL that following my new mapping, EF Core is passing the first and last name of the author in as its parameters. Then it executes the author insert command, passing along those 2 parameters. When we get back to the debugger, you can see that the new author ID value that the procedure returned has been set in the author's author ID property. And finally, just checking the database, there's the new author, Madeline Miller, with the same author ID. Now I just want to look at one more perspective on this, working with a graph. What if I inserted a new author with a new book all at once? And I've got that mapping for overriding insert author, but I don't have one for the book. Here's my method that creates the new author and new book, adds it to the DB set, and calls save changes again. When I run it and look at the SQL, you can see that EF Core used the procedure again to insert the author, but since there's no other stored procedure mappings, It just reverted to its normal behavior of building an insert for the book. And it even has the new author ID that came back from the stored procedure. And just double-checking my objects, there they are with all of the primary and foreign key values that came back from the database. Taking advantage of these mappings is really pretty straightforward. And as you can see, it's not an all-or-nothing application. EF Core will use the procedures that you've mapped, and then it will use its own generated SQL for anything that you haven't mapped. While EF Core is pretty good at creating SQL for querying and persisting data, there will always be times when you want to use your own SQL, whether that's views, stored procedures, or even on-the-fly SQL. You've just learned a lot of ways to do this while still benefiting from EF Core's mapping, SQL execution, and object materialization. You learned about using the from SQL and from SQL raw methods to query the database using raw SQL and stored procedures, again, while still benefiting from EF Core's ability to materialize and track those results. Then you learned how to use migrations if you need to create new database objects like views or stored procedures. Using the migrations is a great way to keep your workflow consistent if you're already using migrations to apply schema changes based on your model updates. You learned about the keyless entities that allow us to have EF Core comprehend entities even if they don't have a key. Keyless entities let you build read-only entities that don't have key properties but can still be mapped to views and fully participate in queries with the EF Core. Then you saw the database execute SQL methods to execute non-query commands on the database through the DB context. And remember that like execute update and execute delete, these do not integrate with a change tracker. I was so happy to be able to show you some capabilities that have come late to EF Core and represent additional feature parity with EF6. Querying for non-scalar or unmapped entities, and mapping stored procedures for inserts, updates, and deletes. If you're tired of working with this console app that we've been using throughout this course, I have good news. In the next module, we'll incorporate EF Core into an ASP.NET Core app so you can see how nicely EF Core integrates with ASP.NET Core. Here are links to resources I mentioned in this module and some others that I think you'll find useful. I'm Julie Lerman, and thanks again for watching EF Core Fundamentals